We can laugh, we can sing, la 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 la.
We can make anything.
Hold my hand.
Make a magical land.
When letters get together, we go alakazam.
We can run, we can slide, we can hide in a box. Are you ready for some fun with the Alphablocks? Alphablocks!
I thought today would never end. What a day for little me. At last I can rest my head. Forget all my worries and set my mind free. Take it easy and climb into bed. Double E? E. Sleepover. E, 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 E. E, 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 E. E, 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 E. E, 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 E.
Get up and play.
E. We feel tired. We need to rest. It's been a long day. We need to go to eat, sleep. We don't want to play. We're busy counting sheep. Sheep. It's no use. I think we might need Bo Peep. Peep. Thank you, Little Bo Peep. Now, will you agree to keep quiet?
Let's go and play somewhere else.
E.
Peace at last.
What a treat!
E, 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 E. E, 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 E. E, 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 E. E, 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 E.
When I'm with A, we make a world-class team. Being busy today, we're running out of steam. All we want is to go off to sleep and dream.
Sorry, kids. Didn't mean to kick it so hard. But since you're awake, fancy a kick around?
Are we ever going to get any peace?
Right. If you can't beat them, join them.
E, 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 E. E, 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 E. E, 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 E. E, 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 E. But when Magic E does his magic on me, I can turn into an athlete. Without a doubt, we can wear you out when we make you all eat, compete.
Everybody, let's have a bed jumping competition. Ready, set, go!
When I'm with E, we say E.
Sleep.
When I'm with A, we say E. Dream. And when Magic E does his magic on me, we say E, E, E. Now you're on the dream team, so let off some steam, team. We won't make a peep, and soon we'll be fast asleep.